Greetings. I'm Dr. Robert Woods with the Great Books Honors College. In this orientation, we will be talking about the whys and the hows of reading the great books, a Christian apologia, that is, a Christian defense of reading the great books and the way in which a distinctly Christian mind would approach the great books. There is certainly to be acknowledged at the very beginning a special indebtedness to Mortimer Adler and his book, How to Read a Book, and Mortimer Adler as the intellectual mind behind the great books movement in the United States of America, of which we are an heir of that movement. I want to begin, though, talking a little bit about some of the programs and services the Great Books Honors College offers. We have a certificate program in the Great Books, a Bachelor of Arts, a Master of Arts, and a PhD in Humanities. They're all Great Books based, which means they all are in significant conversation with the great books. And if you're watching this orientation, you are already part of one of those, and we appreciate that very much. We have on-site and online programs. The Great Books Honors College is a GAF organization, which means Google Apps for Education. We use these extraordinarily interconnected tools to assist us in reading and thinking about and interacting with the great books. If you would like to learn more about our programs, you can go to the studyliberalarts.org website or go to Faulkner University's website and look for the Great Books Honors College there. Let's get into specifically some of the items about the great books. What are the great books? Well, instead of giving a list of different canons proposed by different people through the ages, we'd like to talk about the characteristics or qualities of those books that then move them toward a classification of being the great books. Well, by their very nature, they are difficult. If they were easily accessible, everyone would read them all the time and we would all be having wonderful conversations about them. But the truth is, they do require more effort and energy to work yourself through them. The ideas, the values, the worldviews, the issues that are explored within the great books are not always easily accessible. They frequently move us beyond the time in which we live in and call upon us to think about other times, other cultures, other ways of thinking about things. That being said, though, the great books are both timeless and timely. I have students regularly point out that they are stunned by the insights and the truths that are found within these works that were written hundreds or thousands of years ago, but are relevant to the very moment in which we live. The great books are capable of expanding the reader's horizons. As I mentioned a moment ago, they have the ability to move us beyond the moment that we are locked in. I'll be giving a quote from Lewis Cowan in a moment that says this perfectly. The great books are able to assist the reader in genuine thinking. Certainly, other books allow us to think about things and to encounter ideas that maybe we would not have otherwise, but the great books constantly are calling upon us to think more deeply and richly about these issues that are raised within them. The great books are also helpful in cultivating intellectual virtue, and we'll talk about what this looks like in a later slide. And finally, the great books are enabling of listening skills. They can equip us to become better listeners if we will take the time and energy that they require. Lewis Cowan, in the wonderful book, I would encourage all of you to get this, Invitation to the Classics, says this in an early essay. The classics guard the truths of the human heart from the faddish half-truths of the day by straightening the mind and imagination and enabling their readers to judge for themselves. This says perfectly what I was trying to say in the previous slide. Well, why do we read the great books? It may surprise you that the range of answers are as different as the types of readers that approach the great books. But some read them for pleasure, a kind of intellectual entertainment, if you would. There are those who read the great books because of the joy that they bring to the soul and to the mind. There are those who read And this is kind of borrowed from C.S. Lewis. There are those who read to live. There is an enhancement to life that one receives by reading these masterpieces, these classics. We also read in a kind of leisurely mode, or to engage in leisure. That is a life of contemplation and reflection. Of course, we read for education, that is to learn things that we did not know before. As I mentioned in a previous slide, we also read to assist in cultivating various virtues. Maybe you've never thought about this before, but reading, especially reading demanding works, calls upon a kind of living out of charity and patience and judgment, hope and wisdom. So reading the great books can assist us in cultivating these virtues. Also, we read the great books because it assists us in building an internal landscape of the soul. One ancient author says, imagine the human soul as being a giant empty room, and reading provides furniture for that empty space. Some of us also read because we enjoy getting lost in something else, somewhere else. The great writer J.R.R. Tolkien talked about literature as escape, but not in the sense of just merely taking us out of this world, but in the sense of moving us or removing us from this world for a moment and then bringing us back into it a better person. How does one become a great reader? Well, this first one may surprise you. We should read at whim. Now, of course, if you're in any kind of program in the Great Books Honors College, there are readings that are assigned. But we hope that these readings also encourage you to later in life, and even as you have leisurely time now, to read at a whim. Read what delights you, and read often. Read as a person of charity, of graciousness and wisdom. One author said it years ago that a Christian reader is one who practices the hermeneutic of humility. We are not the literary critic who stands over the author or the work, glaring down upon it with our own preconceived ideas and our ideologically driven biases. But we are that person who submits to the author and to the writing. Now, that does not mean we cannot disagree with these different authors. We certainly should disagree with some of what is found within the great books. But to read Christianly is to read with a spirit of charity and graciousness, moving toward greater wisdom and understanding. Also, great readers read actively. Unlike television shows or even some games, amusing entertainment, reading requires us to be engaged. And the more difficult the reading, the more it calls for us to be a part of that. How do we become active readers? We are those who are marking and taking notes regularly in our books. Now, if you use an e-reader of some sort or you're reading online, you can obviously, most e-readers do not allow you to mark, but you can take notes. Here's another suggestion on becoming a great reader. Read what your favorite authors have read. One example that I frequently give is that of T.S. Eliot, loving Dante. And then reading Dante through T.S. Eliot enables us to see things that we may not see otherwise. And finally, how does one become a great reader? Give deep attention to what we are reading. And we'll talk in just a moment about how we do this on our own, and then we do this in conversation, either with an instructor or a tutor or with others. Let's talk for a moment about the dynamics of reading. Readers, there are, according to the best studies, a few who read passionately. According to some research I've read in the last several years, less than 10% of Americans are what we would call avid or passionate readers. There are those who read moderately, and of course there are many who read little and they read poorly. Let's talk about these books. There are many light and easy books to read. Even C.S. Lewis was not overly critical of these kinds of books. He just suggested we should read them in moderation, and we should read fewer of these books than we do the greats and the masterpieces. There are books that require deep reflection and attention. There are books that are deep by their very nature. They are dense and they are difficult. These require slow, deliberative, and sometimes one suggestion that's been given by various authors is to read out loud. Even the best readers need solitude to read the difficult works. Let's talk, though, about the dynamic between you as an individual encountering a particular poem or play or philosophical writing or work of history, encountering that work on your own, and then encountering that work in the context of a community of Christian thinkers. Most of us do and should read these great works with quiet contemplation, solitary and slow. But that is not our only engagement and interaction with these works. There's also a communal connectivity. It is social, deliberative, and when done well, it is quite lively. Complete your first reading. Mortimer Adler says this about reading: you must be able to say with reasonable certainty, "I understand," before you can say any one of the following things: I agree, or I disagree, or I suspend judgment. What Adler is saying here, and this is one of those many simple, insightful truths in the work, How to Read a Book, is he's making the point that many people, unfortunately, will read something and allow their biases or presuppositions to cancel out what they may actually hear or learn because they are put off by what they read. But before we can make such statements about I agree or I disagree, or I suspend judgment at this moment about what I'm thinking about this work, Adler says we need to have a level of understanding. And this comes with time and practice. Well, let's talk a little bit more about agreeing or disagreeing with an author. 3 ideal conditions for a well-conducted disagreement, according to Mortimer Adler. Acknowledge, first and foremost, your emotions. We may even say your ideas, your ways of thinking about things. Make your own assumptions explicit. Keep those convictions always before you, not to discard them or disregard them, but to be aware of them. And C, make an attempt at impartiality. That is, try to, at times, suspend a judgment about whether you agree or disagree until you understand what the author is saying. There are 4 practical ways to criticize a book negatively, according to Mortimer Adler. And what's true of a book could also be true of a short story or a poem or an essay. This is a practical way to criticize a writing negatively. You are uninformed. There are times when students will start talking about a work that they simply do not know enough about to make an intelligent comment. You are misinformed. One of the most common recurring things among people who read the great books is the experience of, I had always been told this author meant the following, or I had read in a textbook, this author believed the following truths or ideas. I was misinformed. You are illogical. Adler says that sometimes the rules of logic are thrown out the window when we critique and approach different authors. And finally, your analysis is incomplete. It is not uncommon to draw a conclusion, only later to finish a work to draw a very different conclusion. Let's conclude with some thoughts on aids to reading. Mortimer Adler and others behind the great books of the Western world argued that these works should primarily be examined and explored on their own merit, that is, without commentary. Of course, those of us within Christendom have the experience that more often than not, people, when talking about a writing in Scripture, a part of God's holy word, will run to a commentary to see what a commentary says, instead of giving due attention to what the Scripture actually says. That is also true of the great books. Many people, having that sense of being overwhelmed by this daunting work, will run to what a scholar or an authority has to say. Adler and others in the great books of the Western world tradition say that the expert, the authority, when it comes to the great books, are the great books themselves. Let's talk for a moment about the importance of context. The intrinsic reading, that is the context within the book itself, and Adler stressed this tremendously. He often said that one should actually approach the work first this way before one should spend a great deal of time outside of the work looking at external data or external sources and resources. The extrinsic reading is the context of sources outside of the book. Using other books as extrinsic aids. The great books, A Prolonged Conversation in Western Civilization, which provides an even larger context that helps you interpret the book you are reading. In other words, and this is one of the great insights of Mortimer Adler and others behind the Great Book series, often the great books, as they've been put together in a conversation with one another through the ages, and as one author will converse with another author, say for example Virgil conversing with Homer, that Virgil helps us understand Homer, and reading Homer forward helps us understand Virgil. So there is this kind of prolonged internal conversation with the great books themselves. Of course, there are scholarly commentaries and reference books. We frequently in our program would recommend those commentaries and reference books that give significant attention to the primary works. That is, they stress reading the works themselves. Authors like Eva Brann or Peter Kraft in some of their guides to the great books. There, of course, are dictionaries which help us understand what words are about, whether they be in another language or in our own language, in English. Encyclopedias. These are writings that deal with factual information, that give us information about the historical, social milieu or context of a particular work. We're going to turn our attention from the whys and hows of the great books to doing something that very few people do, but can benefit you tremendously when it comes to reading these masterpieces, and that is asking the right questions.